Welcome to Press Coverage. I'm Theo Gremminger, and at Press Coverage, I'm looking to bring you the sharpest guests, and I'm looking to find you the edges you need to win in fantasy football. And if you've listened to any of my podcasts the last few months, I've asked every single guest a few questions that are sort of evergreen now. And one of the questions has been, which offense is going to lead to multiple ADP wins? Which offensive coordinator are you most excited about? And today's guest, we're going to dive into multiple offenses. My guest today is Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points. Scott's podcasted with me a few times at this point, always brings the heat in terms of sharp takes. And Scott, I think you write a fantastic article recently where you took a look at all of the new offensive coordinators. I loved it. We're going to dive into a number of those guys. But what do you have going on right now? What do you guys have coming out at Fantasy Points? We're right around the corner with actual NFL football.
Yeah, really hectic time. We're launching, overhauling our draft generator league importer tools. Going to be called, I think, Fantasy Points Assistant GM or Headquarters. I don't know that we've settled on a name yet, but that's coming very soon. So we've been working on that. We've been working on updating, tweaking, putting out some new tools for the Fantasy Points data suite, including what I think is maybe the best wide receiver stat ever invented. Going to be massive. We've been calling it average separation score. That's coming out very soon. So going to do a lot of content based around that. And then of course I have my big article, the one all of our subscribers have waited all year for, which is my draft guide. And also call it My Guys, where I give you all of my Exodia plays, my must draft players. I'm going to try and keep most of those paywall, not give away too much on this show, but you'll definitely get a few of those when we go into these recent play caller changes. I didn't want to write this article. I kept trying to pawn it off on Ryan Heath, who's such a brilliant writer, but our subs kept asking for it. And I am so glad I wrote this article because there were a few guys where I just catapulted up my rankings after really digging into these play caller changes. It's just so important, especially in today's NFL. And actually, in fact, maybe I could just, the segue for you. I think it's like the most important thing, like in today's NFL, like if you had a do-over draft where you could take any NFL employee, player or coach, like at what point would you start to see Kyle Shanahan, Andy Reid, Sean McVay? Like, is it after the top 2 quarterbacks, after the top 6 quarterbacks? But like somewhere there, it's just those guys, like especially the Shanahan tree, are moving the needle in such a profound way from an NFL standpoint. But obviously also from a fantasy standpoint. How many league winners have come from Sean McVay's offense? Look at what Kyle Shanahan has been able to do with, Mr. Irrelevant quarterback and then a bunch of backup caliber quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting way of looking at it. And I know you talked about that in great detail in the article, but it's sort of the impact that a very, very strong play caller can have on a fantasy season is sort of like having a huge upgrade at quarterback in many sense, because you're getting your best players the ball. You're also potentially having consistent usage. And the proof is in the pudding. You see these guys year in, year out, putting up strong numbers, much like we see with the elite fantasy performers. So I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it from a macro perspective. And I think that there's fantasy analysts who will literally push that aside, Scott, and say it's kind of a coach worship, or, an offensive coordinator doesn't do this, the tendencies, whatever. We're focusing on players. But every year we see these offenses where you'll have multiple guys as huge ADP winners coming from the same team. It happens year in, year out. And when you look at the top 5 scoring offenses in the NFL, you can pretty much guess the offensive coordinators that are going to be producing those sort of offenses at this point as well. So I think it's super interesting. But before we get started in the coordinators, I know you're doing a lot of work with your August articles. Those are great ones to read. You put out some hits over the years, and you've hit on a number of guys. I mean, were huge on Lamar Jackson back in 2019. I think that's one that sort of will stick with you throughout your career. But if you could know the final stats of any single player this year among all veterans, who would it be?
Yeah, so I think there's like a game theory component to this where it's like, I want to know the quarterback because then the quarterback tells you so much about the other pieces that are tied to them. So my cop out answer would be like CJ Stroud, just so like I know, or it's like, is there a value from these three wide receivers who all have really high ADPs? Could CJ Stroud potentially support all three of them, or all three destined to kind of fail to live up to their ADP? So that would be probably my answer. If I can't give a cop out answer, it'd be someone like Cooper Kupp, where it's just like the range of outcomes I think are so high. It's, Sean McVay has said multiple times, like no one knows just how severely banged up and hurt and fighting through injury he was. Stephania Bell too, like hinted at it, where she was like, I don't know that I've ever seen anyone go through what he went through last year. And then before that, it's like a guy who hit like 19 fantasy points and like 25 of his previous 26 full games, which is like never going to happen again. Just insane upside, or a Devon A-Chain. So one of those players with a wide range of outcomes that I'm just so personally curious on. If you're going to force me into not giving the cop-out quarterback answer.
No, I think that both answers are appropriate. A guy like Cooper Kupp could be a massive arbitrage play on where Puka Nacua is being selected if you think that that's in the range of outcomes that he outperforms him. And then the Devon Achane, that's one where I'm sure we'll talk about a little later on the show. But the CJ Stroud one is interesting because every single Houston wide receiver is steamed up to a point where none of them are cheap. And we need CJ Stroud to potentially lead the NFL in touchdown passes and be right up there in passing yardage for him to support those three. We also sort of need him to take a step forward as a runner if he's going to challenge for QB1 overall. I don't think he needs to be an excessively strong rushing quarterback, but we would like to see maybe a few more rushing touchdowns, maybe a little bit more opportunistic scrambling, because that's sort of been the skeleton key to getting QB1 overall production. So CJ Stroud, a really, really fun answer. How about a rookie? There's a lot of them this year. I'm sure you want to know about 10 of them final stats, but if you had to pick one.
Yeah, the cop-out answer would be Caleb Williams, just because of the three wide receivers with their high ADP. The non-cop-out answer would be Jayden Daniels, just because I have so much of him. I have a lot riding on him. Or the funnest answer, which maybe I'm most curious about, is Marvin Harrison Jr. Just because, like, I'm afraid to say this fully with my chest out, but like, it's not obvious to me that he should have a higher ADP than Malik Neighbors. Like, I kind of tweeted something out like that and I got destroyed for it. But like, legitimately, like, it wouldn't shock me if Malik Neighbors is top 3 in targets this year and Marvin Harrison is like, I don't know, 13th. So, and like similar talents in my eyes. So that would be like the real answer. Cop out would be Caleb.
We talked about this on Dynasty Life closer to the NFL draft about Malik Neighbors on sort of a quote unquote bad landing spot in New York. And we both had that bullish, answer back then, Scott, about how we saw this as a 150 target type player. Now I think the market is going to start reflecting that. Wide receiver 20 on Underdog. I wouldn't be surprised that if we get to, FFPC main event season at the end of August, early September, that Malik Neighbors is not steamed up to like wide receiver 15. I think he's going to be closer to Marvin Harrison. Marvin Harrison Jr., he's not going to catch him. Marvin Harrison Jr. is like wide receiver 9, but I think that they're going to converge a little bit closer, as they should. And I think objectively, when you look at Malik Neighbors, he should be valued closer to some of these second-round wide receivers as opposed to these third-round wide receivers, based on the ceiling, based on the talent, and also based on the teammate competition. There's nothing at running back here. I see a lot of, I'm sure that in your upside article, Devin Singletary is not going to be one of the running backs you're pounding the table for. And I see a lot of, fantasy commentators and analysts trying to make the bull case for Singletary just based on the raw touches and availability of the offense. Neighbors is by far the most effective weapon that they have. So I would love to know his final stats. I think I'm going to be drafting a ton of them this month. And if you're in one of my dynasty leagues, I'm happy to overpay for him as well. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to dive into some of these offenses. We're going to try to reveal some offenses that you should be targeting heavily in your drafts. And a lot of these guys are going to pay off at ADP big time.
This episode is made possible by Underdog Fantasy, and Underdog Fantasy is the leader in best ball. When you go to join an Underdog Fantasy best ball draft, it fills very quickly, especially now. It's Best Ball Mania season, baby! Best Ball Mania 5! I can't believe they're at Best Ball Mania 5 already. $15 million in prizes. They're giving out $15 million with $1.5 million to first. Playing in best ball leagues makes you better. It helps train you on player value and strategy. And Underdog offers a lot more than just best ball contests. They offer pick'ems. My new favorite, the golf pick'ems, baseball pick'ems going on throughout the off season. Hit the pick'ems, back to best ball, hit the pick'ems. So use promo code Underworld. Promo code Underworld gets you a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. So they've increased the maximum deposit bonus. It was $100. Now it's up to $125. When you get the Underdog app, use promo code Underworld and go draft your ass off.
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with Scott Barrett of Fantasy Points. And Scott, we're going to dive into a number of these offenses that have first-year offensive coordinators, and there is an absolute ton of them this year. But before we do that, let's take a step back. And this is a question that I ask everybody. If there is an offense that we're not going to cover today that you think could lead to multiple ADP wins, does one stand out to you? And I'll say that, we reference how it happens every year. It happens on the high end. Last year, we saw Detroit. All of their guys hit at ADP. Laporta, Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jared Goff. And then we saw it on the low end with teams like Tampa Bay, where nobody wanted to draft Bucks. We saw Rashad White and Mike Evans and Baker Mayfield all pay off really huge. 2022 was even bigger. Miami and Philadelphia both had a ton of ADP wins with pretty much all of their guys. And then Seattle was an offense that nobody wanted to draft players from. We saw Tyler Lockett that year was drafted as like a low end or a wide receiver 4 and finished as a high end wide receiver 2. And obviously Geno Smith had his miracle, amazing season that year. Is there any offense of sort of a veteran play caller that you think could lead to multiple ADP wins?
Yeah, I think you got to start with the Shanahan tree and Sean McVay. Just their track record, you could read the article, is insane. And I know that's like priced in to some degree, but like it's impossible to overrate them. Like that's how potent and valuable these elite play callers are. Andy Reid as well, Ben Johnson. But the one I would put in that range, and most others wouldn't, that we're for sure sleeping on, underrating, is Sean Payton. His fantasy track record is incredible. A Sean Payton coach backfield has ranked top 2 in fantasy points per game in 9 of the last 12 seasons. I like Bo Nix. I think he's like the perfect fit for this scheme. There's a bunch of stats you want to I kind of think for prospects, analytics are like totally irrelevant for quarterback. Like I'm a nihilist in that regard, but like his stats were off the chain, perfectly suited for a Sean Payton offense at the very least. And look at what Payton's quarterbacks have done since 2018. Taysom Hill, 20.5 fantasy points per game. A washed 40-year-old Drew Brees, 19.8. Russell Wilson, who has been washed for 3+ years, 18 fantasy points per game. Trevor Siemian, 18. Jameis Winston, 17.2. Teddy Bridgewater, 17.1. That's all low-end quarterback 1 production from like really sub-mediocre talents. And so I like him as a late round best ball guy. I'm a Marvin Mims stan. Cortland Sutton, at the very least, touchdown upside for best ball. And again, that backfield, I think there's a lot of upside in that backfield.
It's interesting because I had Sean Siegel on Press Coverage recently. We did a 0 RB discussion, but we also I asked him the same question with the ADP wins, and he's also brought up Denver. And I think what's interesting is that we've seen these offenses sort of left for dead that nobody wants to draft players from lead to ADP wins now for multiple years. Reference Seattle, we reference Tampa Bay, and Denver's so cheap. And the backfield, it's like just pick one or pick 2. I know you were on Audric Estime throughout the draft process. There's some Denver beat writers on him as well. If you're still on Javonte Williams, he's never been cheaper. I like Jaleel McLaughlin. And then wide receiver wise, they're all cheap. Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims sort of are going next to one another, there's a pathway where you could see one of those guys in like shallow home leagues be a huge waiver wire ad when you get to like week 2. And then Cortland Sutton, you brought up, I think he's in a really nice position to return value, like you said, especially in best ball. So that's an interesting one. Let's talk a little bit about the elite play callers. You alluded to this earlier on in the show where you said the elite play callers that can elevate an offense and kind of raise fantasy points. Identify a few more of these elite play callers, maybe dive into a little context here. The article does it very, very well, but you talked about from like a macro perspective how these guys can elevate a fantasy offense, elevate fantasy production. Who are the guys do you think, like, not to keep it too simplistic, are really, really good at what they do and very, very smart at getting the most out of their playmakers?
Yeah, there are a number of like key efficiency hacks in the NFL today. One of the top ones is play action. Like I've been writing about this for 6 years, where it's just like spam play action as much as possible. It's like almost, I can't find a point of diminishing returns. Just spam that as much as possible. It puts an extra strain on the defense. It doesn't matter if your running game is not working, spam play action. And that's huge. And you see that follow with fantasy, fantasy points per dropback skyrocket the more an offense is doing play action. And then the use of motion is a more recent one with Mike McDaniel. These are just a few examples. You could scroll all the way down to the bottom of my article. There's this big footnote section talking about why like the Shanahan offense is so amazing. And it's just because they know all of these key efficiency hacks and they spam them. And there are a lot of offenses like the Saints last year, the Raiders last year, that just did not do that at all. And guess what? You could tell those were pretty bad offenses. And it's no surprise that NFL owners are trying to hire these Shanahan disciples. Not a coincidence at all. From an NFL standpoint, like, let's look at the track record. When Kyle Shanahan first became head coach of the 49ers in Patrick Mahomes' rookie season till now, who leads in EPA per dropback? It's 1, the Chiefs. No surprise, they have the best quarterback in football. And it's 2, the 49ers, who are their quarterbacks? Jimmy Garoppolo, Nick Mullins, CJ Beathard, Brian Hoyer, and then Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant, making up just 16% of that sample. And then Mike McDaniel, you could do the same thing. You could look at, since he's been a play caller or in charge of the running game for the 49ers, his ground games on average would rank like top 2 in any single season. And then who are the running backs? It's all guys drafted round 6, round 7, or not at all. It's Raheem Mostert, Jeff Wilson, Matt Breida, Elijah Mitchell, Alfred Morris. And so it begs the question is like, would you rather have the 15th best quarterback in football or Kyle Shanahan and a backup? Would you rather have the 3rd best running back in football or Mike McDaniel and a guy signed off the street? And then from a fantasy perspective, I spent a lot of time looking at win rates, like redraft win rates. Anatomy of a league winner gets nominated for an FSWA award every year, but just like diving into this. And so in any given season, there's only like 4 players who produce a win rate of 20% or higher, 4 in any given season. And over the last 5-6 seasons, Sean McVay's offenses produce 1.2. Like, it's just,
that's crazy.
So insane. It's 2017, 2018 Todd Gurley, 2023 Kyron Williams, 2021 Cooper Kupp, 2023 Puka Nacua, 2019 Higbee, 2018 Brandon Cooks. Those are guys like it's hard to win your league without. And so it's just it's so important. It's so impactful to dive into this. And so the question everyone at home is asking right now is like, okay, well, who is the new Sean McVay? Who is the new Kyle Shanahan? Guess what? I think Bobby Slowick is that. We saw it last year, right? Like, how dirt cheap were the Texans and how many league winners did they produce? And they would have produced so many more if those players all stayed healthy. The offensive line stayed healthy. If Bobby Slowick wasn't running the ball way more than he should, I think, with Joe Mixon, that'll be a little bit better. Maybe he'll be a little less stubborn, but clearly that was a fantasy goldmine. And I'm seeing a few from these new play callers that have that potential, the potential to, going super late and then making a dramatic difference, where it's like, maybe for the best ball mania, you go back in time, you just go all in on the Texans, you win a shit ton of money. Maybe it's this year, you go all in on, dare I say, the Panthers, or maybe more likely the Falcons, you win a ton of money. So I guess we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I remember last year having this conversation with you about Bobby Slowick. We split an FFPC main event team, and you were talking about just sort of his reputation, about how this guy's going to be a machine. We weren't quite sure how to play the offense at the time, but you were spot on with him. And I think Slowick's a guy that
you were spot on. It was
listen, we had a nice. If anybody doesn't know, we won an FFPC main event league. Abibag Batoba, who's the host of First and 15, which you can see right here on Player Profiler YouTube. Scott and I, and we're running it back. We're gonna drop a show on that, but that's neither here nor there.
Let me just say for the listeners, let me talk you up a little bit. So it's like week 3 or week 4, and it's like CJ Stroud. We need you to go 50%, and I'm like, whoa, I don't know about that. It's 1 or 2 games, and you're like, no. He looks incredible. This is the offense, and lo and behold, so I pushed back way too much on you, and you were dead right for that. So major props.
Yeah, I appreciate that. CJ Stroud bailed out a few of my teams last year where maybe I didn't draft the correct quarterback, but Stroud was good enough to get me through and win some money with. So big hat tip. Now you got to pay up for CJ Stroud, but what a player, what a season. And let's keep this thing going, because let's talk about it. We talked about Slowick a little bit. Before we talk about the first-year play callers, let's talk about these second-year play callers. And I think this is one thing that sort of gets brushed aside a little bit, where it happens with second-year players, Scott, where a lot of times we're looking at the rookies and maybe a second-year value maybe goes a little bit under the radar. Think about like DeVonta Smith's second year in the league, what an ADP win he was. But you also see it with play callers, where we want to talk about these new coordinators, and certainly we're going to talk about Zach Robinson of Atlanta and guys like him. But last year we had a lot of success with first-year play callers. Todd Monken in Baltimore, Slowick in Houston. Then we go down to like Dallas, Arizona. There was a number of them. When we talk about these second-year play callers, is there one that gets you really excited, that you think maybe this offense could do better, perform better, or maybe an elite offense that you think could take the next step of these second-year play callers?
Yeah, so it's for sure Houston. It's just like, look at how insanely productive and efficient that offense was. That was despite like the worst offensive line injury luck in football. That was in spite Tank Dell going down, Nico Collins dealing with injuries. And then we have this upgrade, Robert Woods to Stephon Diggs. Like, are you kidding me? This is, and there was a plenty of meat left on the bone in that offense. Like Slowick was so stubbornly run heavy, which didn't make sense. He was kind of like Kyle Shanahan, so like, who can be stubbornly run heavy, but he is the best running back in football and this elite defense. And he did it with Damian Pierce, who's like the worst fit for that outside zone scheme. So major upgrade with Joe Mixon. So they're going to be more efficient on the ground. I think he kind of knows, and like the personnel moves they've made have kind of hinted at like, or maybe he can be less foolishly stubborn when it comes to running the ball and leaning into this amazing passing game that now has like one of the best wide receiver trios in football. And it really just has the potential to break leagues this year. If this is the best offense in football, really wouldn't shock me. And so like, you have to start at the top with him, and it's, it's like you said, these sophomore play callers, it's a brand new offense. It's tough for, players to get accustomed to it. I know TJ Hawkinson has talked about this on a podcast recently, where it's like the Ben Johnson offense, like it really took until week 6 until the team understood it. And then like, once they turn that corner, it's like, oh, Detroit is now just a top 5 offense every single year. The one after Slowick, the less obvious one I want to point out is Drew Petzig and the Arizona Cardinals. That running game was insanely efficient. It was kind of like a little bit of a bummer for fantasy, in just that, James Conner wasn't seeing the target volume he typically received, but that was, I don't know, the second most efficient ground game in football behind the Dolphins by a ton of different metrics, just by team yards per carry, even. I think they were second. And so the added my guy Trey Benson. I don't think he's going to do much for fantasy this year, but certainly the year after that.
Oh, don't say that! Don't say that, Scott. Come on, keep us. We got Trey Benson bags.
I love Trey. So he's awesome, and so it's just like I just think that ground game is going to be insanely efficient, and then the move Trey McBride destroying against zone coverage, eating in zone coverage. I'm playing him in DFS in zone heavy matchups. And now you have what did he not have last year? He didn't have a single guy who could win in man coverage. He had like Rondale Moore, bottom 5, Michael Wilson, bottom 5, and winning against man coverage. And now they have an elite alpha wide receiver 1, outside man beater, Marvin Harrison Jr. So that offense is going to take a big step forward. Going to be really fun.
Well, when we get to the end of the show, you're going to reveal this year's version of, and I'll say your guy, Danny Kelly, gave a this year's Devon Achane is Trey Benson about a month and a half ago on Dynasty Life. So,
that's a little sacrilegious for how much I know Danny Kelly loves Achane. He was higher on Achane than anyone. We'll get to it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So let's start out with the offense that we probably want to spend the least amount of time on, and I think drafters are ignoring for the most part the New England Patriots. We have Alex Van Pelt taking over as offensive coordinator. Jared Mayo obviously elevated to the head coaching position. But one thing that your article talks about is RB usage, and one player I've been sort of talking up as a value is Rhamondre Stevenson. I had him in my most recent article on Player Profiler, where I talked about post-hype sleepers, sort of ADP bounce-back candidates. I think Rhamondre is set up for a strong season. Do you see that with Alex Van Pelt in terms of his usage?
Yeah, so there's really not much to go on with Alex Van Pelt. The only thing I'll say is, like, we know what Belichick liked. It was, stubborn running back by committee situation where ideally you have your LeGarrette Blount and then you have your James White scat back kind of thing. And so, like, just removing him from the picture, there's upside for Rhamondre to become a bell cow. And like, where is he priced on Underdog? It's like, if he's a committee back with Antonio Gibson, he's a slight value. If he's a bell cow, he's a potential league winner, an amazing value. And what's the competition? Antonio Gibson. Like, I'm sorry, I think Antonio Gibson stinks. According to my sources, a top NFL insider, like, the Commanders, like, were so happy to get rid of him. They have this like custom internal metric called like yards left on the field due to vision or something like that. And he was dead last every single year. I think Rhamondre is an underrated pass catcher. I don't think Gibson has really impressed me too much. I know he was this, wide receiver in college, but sort of underwhelmed. And so, just the range of outcomes is like, if he's a committee back in this offense that wants to pound the rock, like, I think he's a great value. If he's a bell cow, he could be a league winner. And Van Pelt's track record with running backs is great. It's hard to divorce, Nick Chubb being elite from that. But for sure. I'm big on Rhamondre, who, by the way, also was just made the 7th highest paid running back in football. And he did that, after OTAs, getting a look at him versus Gibson in the drills. So I'm with you on Rhamondre for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. We go back to the 2021 draft class. If I would have told you that Rhamondre Stevenson at the time of the draft would be getting this mega contract, and Najee Harris, they would be declining to give him the 5th-year option. It just, shout out to Rhamondre. So I'll go with that.
He was my guy. I think I comped him to LeGarrette Blount a little bit, and just that he was like a guy who like has great lateral agility and movement that you like wouldn't suspect given his size and how like bruising and pounding he could be just running on a typical carry.
Yeah, I mean, he had 69 receptions in 2022, and I think people need to kind of remind them. People, often will say that was because of the players around him, but I think that the 3 wide receiver sets, when you come down to it in New England, are going to end up being Jalen Polk, Javon Baker, and Pop Douglas. So you're talking about a second-year player with 2 rookies. 2 wide sets might actually be the 2 rookie wide receivers. So they're going to have to lean heavily on Rhamondre. But let's go to a little bit more exciting offenses here. Let's start with Buffalo. Buffalo, this is technically not a new offensive coordinator because we saw it for about half the season. Ken Dorsey took over last November, and we see this offense sort of shift when he took over. Stephon Diggs' usage went down. James Cook's usage went up. How do you expect this offense to look this year? Maybe picking a wide receiver that we should be betting on, because I think that drafters are sort of doing mental gymnastics trying to figure that one out as well.
Yeah, so the wide receiver to draft, I think, would be Curtis Samuel. I was projecting it to be based on like what the GM and coaches have said is Keon Coleman as the X. But maybe that's Mac Hollins to start the year. I was not high on Coleman as a prospect, but like it wouldn't shock me if he gets like double-digit touchdowns and just like horrible yards per target, something like that. And then the slot. Then Curtis Samuel as the Y on the outside.
And probably Shakir.
Shakir in the slot, which isn't great for a team that likes to run a lot of 12 personnel. So he's just going to be a part-time player. And then Curtis Samuel, who was awesome last time he was with Joe Brady, had over 1,000 yards from scrimmage, had 97 targets, 41 carries. His numbers looked terrible last year and the year before that, but I will say he was much better out wide, and that's also where he was with Joe Brady. So having him on the outside, I think is like great for him. And right now at cost, I would say he's the best value. I don't know that he's a target for me in redraft leagues, but best ball for sure. I think there's going to be some headaches with this receiver room, and it might even be a little bit more of a committee, or at least it's like a different one going off every week. But best value, I'd say, for best ball would be Curtis Samuel.
Dalton Kincaid is a player that I've been very high on in Dynasty, but now you're paying for it in redraft. He's a second rounder in FFPC drafts and FFC drafts. He's like a fifth rounder. This is a player where a lot of people are betting on him to take a massive step forward. Now you've got these sort of reports that Dawson Knox is going to be a little bit more involved than maybe we would like. What's your initial lean? And I know that a lot of your redraft stuff is not going to come out till the end of the month, but initial lean on Kincaid based on what we've seen so far from Dorsey.
Yeah. So it's not just the tight end 4, tight end 5 ADP, but it's also the opportunity cost in drafting him where he's going. You're foregoing a running back or a wide receiver. And I just can't get on board with that. When you look at the numbers, so the last 3 seasons, you look at the top 7 tight ends in any given year, the average about 31 routes per game, about 77% route share. 0 of those 21 tight ends average fewer than 25.5 routes run per game. And then look at what he did last year over those last 6 games, including the postseason, 21.7 routes per game. So it was below that. It was a 64.7 route share. So it's like, that's just not enough. It's just like so hard to pay off this ADP with that route share. And it's like, why would you move from Dawson Knox? You wouldn't. When I looked into the numbers, it's Buffalo last year was, I think, the first or second most efficient offense in football by adjusted net yards per attempt in 12 personnel. By 11, they were like bottom 10. And those 3 wide receivers, I don't think are any better. So I don't see them moving away from. They were also more efficient in the ground game in 12 personnel. So I don't see them moving away from that. There's certainly the possibility that, Kincaid is just their new, like the Buffalo's Travis Kelce. And I love the player. It's just looking at the range of outcomes and the cost and the opportunity cost. He's not someone I expect to have much exposure to.
Yeah, and for me, I've been very bullish on him, but I think you do make a great point that based on that sort of ADP and FFPC, he needs to be targeted 125 times, 130 times. He needs to give you like top 5 tight end targets in terms of raw targets. Dawson Knox argument, like, I just don't think he's going to go away. I think Josh Allen likes him. So I don't know. I found myself pivoting a little bit more in these second rounds than I thought I would have. But I have so many dynasty bags that I hope I'm wrong a little bit there. Let's talk about Pittsburgh, though. This is Arthur Smith coming over from Atlanta. Take this any way you want here, Scott. Are we excited about the tight end position in an Arthur Smith-led offense? And I'll say galaxy brain-wise, if I combine Jonnu Smith and Kyle Pitts together from last year, that makes a pretty strong tight end. There is some Pat Freiermuth enthusiasm. Do you share it?
I mean, it's like, he had Drake London and Drake London couldn't get it done. Like Drake London should never put up the fantasy points per game that Drake London put up with Arthur Smith. Kyle Pitts, the exact same thing. So why is there optimism on Pat Freiermuth? You could say, yes, he loves to target tight ends, but he loves to target 2 of them, right? And it's the same thing with Kincaid. It's like the route share isn't there. They drafted Darnell Washington, prospect many people were excited about. I will just say, like, one thing that hurt Kyle Pitts was they were putting him as an outside wide receiver, which is just like putting him at such a disadvantage. Like, he's running routes against elite cornerbacks. That's going to hurt his fantasy production. I don't think you're going to do that with Pat Freiermuth. Pitts ran a ton of go routes. You're not going to do that with Pat Freiermuth. So it's possible, go back to the Delaney Walker days. Delaney Walker was a PPR cheat code under Arthur Smith. It's possible. Maybe best ball, he's fine. I just say he's not a target for me. The player I got excited about when I was writing this article that I wasn't expecting to get excited about was Najee Harris. And so Jaylen Warren, arguably the most efficient running back in football last year by a number of great metrics. But I was digging into it. Warren, uber elite in man gap schemes, but Najee Harris was more efficient than Warren and well above the league average rate against zone runs. He really struggled again in man gap schemes. And Arthur Smith's Falcons were top 2 in zone concept run percentage in each of the last 3 seasons. So it is a offense that's much better suited for Najee. And what do we know about an Arthur Smith-led offense? It's going to be World War II era levels of run heavy. Excuse me. It's going to be slow paced. I think it's going to be more beneficial for the running backs. And then George Pickens, it goes back to the Drake London thing. It's like if Drake London couldn't get it done. And by the way, I am not bullish at all on Russell Wilson. Greg Cassell told me 4 years ago that Russell Wilson's washed, and he's only ever looked washed since then. So, but I don't know. I just like the player so much. And I think he reminds me of like a rich man's Cortland Sutton. So I think he's a good fit for Russell Wilson. That I just say the ADP is good on him. But
yeah, I mean, I had Ryan Heath on, who does great work for you over at Fantasy Points. He talked about Pickens, but I sort of got him to capitulate that, yeah, maybe Pickens is not going to be a wide receiver 1 in this offense, but the ADP has not steamed up to the point where you can't see him kind of easily beating it. My only concern is, Arthur Smith is a guy where we've never seen a wide receiver, including A.J. Brown, including Drake London, command enough targets to really be a league winner type. We've never seen a guy get more than like 120 targets. So Pickens is a guy where we would love to see. I think it's funny if we would have seen Zach Robinson take the Pittsburgh job instead of the Atlanta job, we would be standing on our head to get George Pickens right now. And instead it's sort of like we're worried about the number of targets. We're worried about the usage. So, but Pickens is not going to hurt you where he's going. He never really hasn't steamed up. Last year led the league in yards per reception. Very talented player and still only 23 years old. Let's keep this going. An offense that people are getting excited about in terms of passing volume and in terms of just stylistic changes is Tennessee. Brian Callahan comes over from Cincinnati. Cincinnati over the last 3 years was top 7 in both passing yardage and points per game. Callahan is a guy that was very successful over there. He had the one season where he had 3,000-yard receivers on the same team. Will Levis, you had a very funny. Give the exact quote. Is it drunk Jameis Winston?
On steroids, yes.
Oh, drunk and on steroids, right?
Yeah, yes.
That's all. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So, well, first off, Callahan's never called plays at the NFL level, but we do know this is going to be heavily influenced by his time with Cincinnati over the last 2 seasons when Joe Burrow was healthy. Cincinnati far and away led in pass rate over expectation. They were also, by the way, Tennessee bottom 5. They were also one of the top 5 fastest offenses in football. Tennessee bottom 5 slowest. What does that mean? A lot more plays, a lot more passing plays, a lot of fantasy potential. The one holdup here is Will Levis is this could be really bad. This could be like Justin Fields without the rushing levels of bad. Cause you look at the turnover worthy throw rate, by far worse in the league. You look at pressure to sack ratio, by far all right, bottom 3, I guess. I don't know. Zach Wilson and Justin Fields were probably up there, but really bad. If you look at big time throw rate or hero throw rate, best in the league. So there is that. So like from a best ball perspective, you can get excited about a Will Levis, but I'm more concerned about these pass catchers. I think the first article I did on wide receivers, I said DeAndre Hopkins is a great value or a better value than Calvin Ridley, but I actually flipped it. I'm now way more excited about Calvin Ridley, especially at ADP, and they're going kind of close together. And it really just comes down to one thing to me. It's Brian Callahan said he has the Jamar Chase role in the offense. And it's just like one of those things where it's like, all right, guess what? You just moved up 2 tiers in my rankings because listen, I know this isn't a Jamar Chase level talent, but that's, no matter who that is, that's a super valuable role. Chase led the league in screen targets last year, so massive floor. And it's in the article. I talk about how Doug Peterson wide receivers have always been fantasy poison, unless maybe it's like a Christian Kirk slot, but like really only 1 or 2 seasons of that. And he just used in like the worst way possible, and now he's going to be used in potentially like the best way possible. Got paid a ton of money. And so that was something that, working through this article, a guy I just immediately moved up multiple tiers. I will also say, if you are in a best ball draft, Tajay Spears is one of the best late round, high floor wide receiver values you can make. They're just going to run a ton of 11 personnel. And then, running back, I'm excited about Tajay Spears. What are they going to do? They're going to have like an RB1A, RB1B platoon where they're both every down running backs rotating, but there's upside for one running back to be a hot hand to pull away. And I have to think that's Tajay Spears after Pollard's disappointment last year. Tajay's, college profile, what he flashed last year, and insane stat from Jacob Gibbs is that he's the perfect fit for a Brian Callahan rushing scheme. Bengals ran a ton out of shotgun. Spears averaged 7 yards per carry from the gun in college, one of the highest marks ever. He also averaged 8.4 yards per carry on man gap concepts, the best ever by EPA per run. And this is going to be a very, very heavy man gap run scheme, way more than it was last year. So perfect fit for that offense. So like Tajay Spears as a value, like Boyd as a late round high floor option, really like Calvin Ridley's upside at cost. And maybe if Will Levis, there's just a wide range of outcomes on him, is if he could be drunk Jameis Winston on steroids. Like that might be all it takes. Jameis Winston, not on steroids, supported Chris Godwin and Mike Evans as fantasy wide receiver ones not too long ago, in a similar kind of offense in terms of pace of play and pass heavy rates. So plenty of potential, just wide range of outcomes on this offense.
It's super fun when you see an offense change so dramatically philosophically with what Tennessee's doing. And I'll say that the Ridley D-Hops argument, it's really interesting because D-Hops has been one that I've been on for a while. But now you're starting to see the ADPs converging. They were like side by side in NFFC drafts with Ridley and D-Hops, whereas when we started this process, like in May, there was a wide gap between the two of them. So I agree, like Ridley starts becoming a value as he's very close to, it's sort of a flip a coin as to who's the wide receiver leader there. I love Spears as well. 0 RB builds, hero RB builds. He's a really fun player. Rookie running backs who catch 50 balls their first year, those guys usually come back for more. It's a metric where we like to see that initial initial success as a receiver at the running back position, usually an indicator of more good things to come in fantasy. Let's keep this going with Las Vegas, sort of another recycled offensive coordinator with Luke Getsy coming over. Let's talk about Getsy and what he got out of DJ Moore last year as the wide receiver 1 in Chicago. DeVonta Adams has had the most targets of anyone in the NFL over the last 3 years, 169 plus targets for 3 straight seasons. What are your expectations with him this year? And also, let's talk about Brock Bowers, who's a guy that we're very, very excited about at Player Profiler, and I know you probably are as well as a prospect. How do we see him fitting in this offense in year 1?
Yeah, I wrote this like gigantic love letter to Brock Bowers. Like in my rookie tight end article every year, I do a dank stats section, and there's never been a longer or more effusive and praised dank stats section than for Brock Bowers. Love the prospect. Hate the landing spot. Hate it. Michael Mayer too is like a prospect I was still excited about before the draft. Over the last 15 years, there's only ever been 2 FBS tight ends with multiple 800-yard seasons. Brock Bowers, Michael Mayer, and now they're on the same team competing for targets. You hate to see that. The Rams tried desperately to trade up to draft Brock Bowers.
Oh, can you imagine? Can you imagine Bowers in a McVay offense? It would be incredible.
Over. Oh my
and
God.
Also, he would be Cooper Kupp year 2. In like
I know.
It would be like 160 targets. Brock Bowers.
So heartbreaking. So sorry to make the listeners at home relive that. Yeah, it's just, it's the rookie tight end thing, which maybe we're doing away with after last year's results. But it's just like poor quarterback play, a run heavy offense. Devontae Adams is going to be a target hog. You asked about DJ Moore. I don't know about the overlap there. It's just watch the receiver show on Netflix, and it's just like they just want to keep Devontae happy at all cost. And also, like, I still think he's got it. Like, I still think he's good. So if he leaves the league again in target share, I think, that's probably my projection is that's what happens. On Luke Getsy in general, I will just say there's a chance he's really bad and doesn't know what he's doing, just because the 2022 to 23 Bears offense averaged 156.3 passing yards per game. That's like World War II era levels. It's so insanely bad. Maybe that's Justin Fields' limitations as a passer, and I think it is to like a large degree. But it is a concern we have to mention. Really, for me, just the one big takeaway, it was more Antonio Pierce than Luke Getsy. And that's that he said he had a magic number of touches for his running back in every single game. He wanted them to hit 20 plus carries. Josh Jacobs hit that in 3 of 4 healthy games, averaging 24 opportunities per game, 16 fantasy points per game. Zamir White did that in 3 of 4 starts, just about 24 opportunities per game, 15.2 fantasy points per game. In both cases, those are, low end RB1 production. So if you want to say he's a best ball value, it's in spite of, maybe he's not the best talent in the world. Hard to disagree with that, just projecting out volume. They've referred to Alexander Madison as a depth piece. Dylan Lobby is, prototypical scat back. I wouldn't expect more than just, half a handful of carries per game. So yeah, that's kind of what you're looking at there. He's not really an outright target for me, but just a projectable volume. I get it.
Zamir White's a really, really weird one because it's the sort of profile that you want to fade in the dead zone. A guy who doesn't really have a whole lot of sample size, sort of a last year's waiver wire pickup, this year's 6th or 7th round draft pick. But it's like you said, it's kind of hard not to see them at least giving him the ball as much as possible early on. And I'll say it's a Luke Getsy offense run by Gardner Minshew or AOC. So there's not exactly like a quarterback upgrade here. It's a really, really weird one. How about DeVonta Smith? Is DeVonta Smith going to be a potential cheat code for drafters? This is a player where last year we were having to use a very premium wide receiver pick on him. He had steamed up near wide receiver 1 level. He was going very closely to A.J. Brown in terms of overall ADP. Now there's a sizable gap between the two, and it's warranted. AJ's earned that the last 2 years. He's been just remarkable, back-to-back 1,400-yard seasons in Philadelphia. But now DeVonta Smith, he could be the real beneficiary of Kellen Moore taking over in Philly.
Yeah. So I don't think I have I've done like a dozen or 2 dozen underdog drafts so far. I don't think I have a single DeVonta Smith share, but like that needs to change because something happened yesterday that has got me really excited. Avonte Maddox, the cornerback for the Eagles, said he's noticed DeVonta Smith in the slot a lot more than he's used to seeing. And I was saying this is exactly what we were waiting to hear from him. So I went all in on Keenan Allen last year, one of my must-draft players. And that was because he told us, I'm playing the CeeDee Lamb role in Kellen Moore's offense. That means a lot of, PPR cheat code like targets, screens, gimmies like that, a lot of motion, which is an efficiency hack at the NFL level for teams, but also for the wide receivers themselves. And so I know they're going to use AJ Brown in the slot more. They're going to move these guys around, but like the more, whatever the sliding scale of DeVonta Smith in the slot is, like the higher that percentage of routes in the slot, the better it is, the higher the likelihood he has of really, breaking leagues or immense upside. Since he's entered the league, he's run just 23% of his routes from the slot. Over that span, 2.48 yards per route run from the slot. That ranks 7th best, way better than outside, 1.66 yards per route run. He still holds the PFF college era record for career yards per route run from the slot, 4.96. Next closest, Jalen Waddle, 3.60. Garrett Wilson, interestingly enough, was actually 3rd on that list. And so it's just like, this is where he belongs. And this is one of the most valuable roles in fantasy. So like, I just want to hear like DeVonta Smith, full-time slot player, but we've already heard he's going to be in the slot a lot more. So he is one player I need to go back over my rankings, move up based on this, but have to be really excited about this. Like, this is a really talented player. I know AJ Brown is as well, but really talented player who was misused. And now it looks like Kellen Moore with the Eagles is going to remedy that.
Yeah, and it could just be a case of extreme consolidation like we saw 2 years ago, where DeVonta Smith and AJ Brown both finished as wide receiver ones. Smith was an even bigger ADP win that year, but his targets last year were down, well below 120. We want to see him get back up to the 135, 140 range, which I think is very much in the realm of possibility. Do you have any feel here? This is the one with Saquon. Saquon Barkley steps into a situation where he's being drafted very highly. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Kellen Moore offense. Are we going to force Jalen Hurts to check down to running backs more? Do you have a feel here? Because I think this is sort of a big range of outcomes for Saquon Barkley's finish this year, Scott. Or is this sort of up in the air?
Well, Kellen Moore has always kind of been a committee guy. And I think, Sirianni, we know, likes Gainwell way more than he should. It's also Jalen Hurts is there to vulture touchdowns, doesn't frequently target the running backs. I'm not in on him. I don't feel amazing about it. It is Saquon Barkley, right? And it is a great offense. And, Miles Sanders, isn't that talented. He put up numbers a few years ago and all that. DeAndre Swift, had some big spike weeks, but to me, it's really just the opportunity cost of wide receivers in that range or running backs going a little bit later. I like significantly more. So I'm kind of out on him. I don't feel amazing, but he's not someone I'm drafting.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about the Chargers. Greg Roman takes over with Harbaugh. We have Justin Herbert seems sort of out of place in this role. Offensive personnel wise, I agree with your article that it's sort of hard to like any of their tight ends. There's nobody. I mean, we're not going to draft any of those guys. Maybe one of them beats expectations, but hard to see any of them in our fantasy lineups. Ladd McConkey steaming up a little bit, and the running backs. We've seen Greg Roman running backs get a ton of volume. Obviously, 2019, they set the NFL record in rushing yardage. Lamar Jackson had his incredible season. Sort of your overall vibes with this offense. Justin Herbert as a potential value, or is the market correctly fading him as a bad fit with Greg Roman?
So I think it's right that this is going to be a really slow-paced, run-heavy offense that wins on their defense, and that's massively detrimental to Justin Herbert. If he was just league average in dropbacks per game, because remember, he's typically top 3, instead of being, like a mid-range QB1, he'd be mid-range QB2, high-end QB2, like really damaging to him. The one upside argument you can make is he's a freak athlete. Like he's kind of like a Josh Allen clone. He's actually a Devin Singletary clone. If Devin Singletary was like a foot taller and like 90 pounds heavier, just in terms of like the events they both ran. And Greg Roman, this is a big reason why I had MVP bets on Lamar Jackson in his sophomore season at 100-1 odds is he was the hypermobile QB whisperer. So like one thing that could be a saving grace, and like he could be a high-end QB1 is if he runs more. We've heard like hints and whispers, but nothing yet for me to move him up in my rankings. So right now he's around where ADP has him. I will say, when I wrote, obviously there's value to the running backs. I like Gus Edwards. I like J.K. Dobbins in spite of the injury risk. Kamani Vidal, I get it. I just didn't think he was a great prospect, wasn't drafted very high, but certainly get it. Two running backs who, Edwards is like currently hurt. J.K. Dobbins is always hurt. When I wrote it, I said, I don't know about the wide receivers. No one's popping to me yet, but that could change soon. Ladd McConkey, love the talent. I think he has superstar potential, but right now he's not on the field in two wide receiver sets. Quentin Johnson, by the way, is not on the field with ones at all. He's dead. The player for particularly best ball, and I guess redraft too, is Josh Palmer. So it wasn't when I wrote this article 3 or 4 weeks ago, but today, great value. It's just think about it. It's like, quarterback rapport is really important, especially in the install of a new offense. And like no receiver on this team has multiple touchdowns with Justin Herbert, except for Josh Palmer, and like clear rapport. And I was digging deeper into the numbers. It's Josh Palmer, or this is Jacob Gibbs, by the way. He averaged nearly 2.0 yards per route run without Mike Williams on the field last year. He averaged 2.48 yards per route run as the X. Across his career, 1.78 as the X. And so I think he's going to be their number one. It could be Ladd McConkey in the second half. Ladd McConkey could be a league winner in the second half if they use him how they should. But so I kind of think both are values right now for best ball. Probably want to be most overweight on Josh Palmer. And I think he's a great pick.
It's super easy to build a secondary stack right now with Justin Herbert and Josh Palmer. There's been a couple sharp people that have come on press coverage, First Class Fantasy, that have been on Josh Palmer. So that's an interesting one for sure. Let's talk about one player who's absolutely not flying under the radar. It's Jayden Daniels. You've got to pay a QB1 price for him, but is QB11 way too cheap based on how he could be in a Cliff Kingsbury run offense this year?
Yeah, it's way too cheap. So I do this article, My Guys. I also do Anatomy of a League Winner, and Anatomy of a League Winner is this big macro piece. And I'm just thinking about just not even writing it because the micro is the macro. And for the quarterback position, it's just I don't know that I need to say anything else other than just draft Jayden Daniels in every single league. QB11 is way too low. My track record on quarterbacks every year, if you just take my number one recommended quarterback, is Lamar Jackson in 2019. It was Josh Allen in his breakout year. It was Jalen Hurts in his breakout year. Justin Fields in his breakout year. It was Anthony Richardson last year. Poor one out for that brutal injury. But look at ADP. So I think the process was on point. Most fantasy points per drop back in the league. And what do they all have in common, right? It's a quarterback who runs and is young, and people need to see it. You have to understand the floor is so massive for these players. Justin Fields is not good at football. He was amazing at fantasy. And guess what? I think Jayden Fields is similar to Justin Fields as a runner and good at football. I think the dude is really, so he has the potential to wreck leagues in the way that Jalen Hurts has the potential, has wrecked leagues. Josh Allen has wrecked leagues. And just to tie this back to the play callers, that's such a key point. I could talk about Jayden Daniels' second best ever fantasy points per drop back last year, or fantasy points per game last year. But Cliff Kingsbury, probably not a great play caller from an NFL standpoint, amazing play caller from a fantasy standpoint. Just a fast paced offense, which is great. So they're going to run a ton of plays. First in situation neutral pace of play, first in no huddle rate, fourth in dropbacks per game when he was with Arizona through 4 seasons. Kyler Murray ran a shit ton, 8.3 rushing attempts per game, 25.8 fantasy points per game in 2020. And so you just put it all together and it's just I don't really need to say anything beyond that. It's just Jayden Daniels. That's the quarterback you're drafting in every single league if this price holds.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that this is it's almost like a free one where
free
the guy
he
could have 800 rushing yards, and also his downfield passing ability at LSU, very, very impressive. Everything about this situation, the vibes are great right now. When it comes to the media in Washington, the players, There's a connection with McLaurin. And you talked a little bit, what I think is interesting is the slot wide receiver in a Cliff Kingsbury offense is also potentially underrated. Could we see Luke McCaffrey be a guy, maybe not in our fantasy lineups, but sort of beating expectations and having a fun season?
Yeah. So Jim Nagy, director of the Senior Bowl, came on my podcast either before the draft, told me Luke McCaffrey is this year's Puka Nacua. Had him on after the draft, told me Luke McCaffrey is this year's Puka Nacua. I've tweeted about just Puka, multiple times about like how good he was last year, projections. And each time Jim Nagy replies to that tweet is like, Luke McCaffrey is this year's Puka Nacua. So the guy, amazing track record, NFL scout for multiple teams, super well respected, great at spotting breakouts. Just look at like all of the under the radar league winners who've come out of the Senior Bowl, Tank Dell, Puka Nacua 2 years ago. And so, yeah, like I didn't love the talent, but like, I kind of trust Jim Nagy on this one a little bit more than my model, especially for someone like Luke McCaffrey, who changed positions just a few years ago. There's some nuance there. And so Cliff Kingsbury loves the slot, features the slot. In 2022, Greg Dortch, my guy, Rondale Moore, not my guy, combined, just you take the games, either one led in slot routes, averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game. There's a wide receiver 12 numbers. Kingsbury's offense gets the ball out, one of the fastest rates in the league. They peppered the short area of the field at one of the top 5 highest rates in the league. Tons of buzz on McCaffrey, spending extra time with Jayden Daniels before practice, after practice. And so like, I'm not a big like stacker, especially with these hyper mobile quarterbacks. So on a lot of these teams, I'm drafting Jayden Daniels on Underdog. I'll have Luke McCaffrey. I might even have Zach Ertz. If I don't love my tight end 3, I'll just wait to the last round. But So redraft league, I don't know that I'd sweat it. I just keep an eye on him on your waiver wire, but for sure, best ball, he's one of the better last round picks.
Yeah. And if you're an FFPC or NFFC drafter, you can get McCaffrey in like round 17, round 18. It's not going to cost you anything. If we see the usage in week 1 much higher than anticipated, he's a really interesting one. Scott brings up the fact that he's a converted quarterback. This could be a guy where we've actually seen it in OTAs. They were lining him up on some running back snaps. So I think that they have a plan for him, certainly athletic enough, and the pedigree is great. Let's talk about the Saints briefly. My question to you is, you have Clint Kubiak. If we look by his dad, Gary, they were Gary Kubiak's offenses were top 12 in rushing yards 13 out of 13 times, and they finished top 5 10 times. My question to you is, the player that I think is very interesting in terms of leagues where he's tight end eligible is Taysom Hill, because there's been some vibes here where they're going to try to use him every game instead of situationally. And when you look at their personnel, Kendre Miller's a guy that they're down on. They're throwing the guy under the bus as he can't stay healthy. They don't really have a slot wide receiver to speak of, and Alvin Kamara is getting older. To me, Taysom Hill's interesting. Could you see a scenario where Clint Kubiak actually uses Taysom Hill and he could have like a bizarro season where he ends up being a really helpful player for drafters where he is tight end eligible?
Yeah, I'll just say I love Taysom Hill. Like, he might be my favorite player in the NFL. Like, he's just so fun. Like, all the different, like, his highlight reel is him blocking punts, throwing touchdowns, catching touchdowns, rushing for touchdowns, making tackles on special. He's just like a freak of nature. For fantasy, he's one of my least favorite players just because he's so hard to project. Whatever you say, like, I could get on board with. My only question is, like, what are the leagues where he's not a quarterback by designation?
So FFPC still has him as a quarterback, but NFFC, it's like a little bit of a cheat code right now. A lot of people watch the show are NFFC drafters. My take is, in NFFC right now, you should draft Taysom Hill every draft because you can get him after round 15, and we'll know early on. Like, let's see what happens in game 1 and game 2. But I know Taysom Hill has talked about it a lot, how this is the first time that the offensive coordinator is sort of talking to me this way. My role is going to be more consistent. Then we saw multiple Saints coaches sort of backing this up. And then you have the Juwan Johnson injury. So it's sort of a perfect storm for maybe
Or
we
he's
do
back,
see
by the
Taysom.
way.
He's back, but he missed some
Oh,
time.
okay. All right. Hey,
So,
no, fair
hey,
point.
listen, the
Yeah.
narrative is reps here. We got Taysom Hill a lot
That's
at
right.
tight end.
Brand new offense.
Vibes. So yeah,
I
that was
like it. I like I said, it's such a headache for me. I kind of just put zero mental bandwidth towards it, but you make a really good case.
Rashid Shaheed, you talked about as a potential value as well. I've had some smart people on Rashid Shaheed. You seem to be on that train as well, Scott. Maybe talk about your enthusiasm for him, or is it just enthusiasm for the role that he's in?
Yeah, so it's enthusiasm for both receivers. So we talk about the efficiency hacks, play action, use of motion. Saints were like bottom one, I think, in both of those last year, bottom two in both. And QBX should be top three in both. And that's just like a major efficiency hack, again, at the team level, but also for these receivers. And then you look at like the underlying statistics last 2 years on play action, both of these guys, elite. You look at by motion, I think Chris Olave was number one in yards per route run. So I'm stealing this from Rich Rebar mostly, but so like major benefit to both. But Rashid Shaheed is my guy. Like he's been my guy since, he scored his second touchdown in the NFL. Maybe even the first one. It was like, this guy's fast. I added him to all my deep roster dynasty leagues. But you look at over the last 20 games, both wide receivers played. Chris Olave, 67 yards per game, Rashid Shaheed 52, wide receiver 19 versus wide receiver 35, 2.22 yards per route run versus 2.01, wide receiver 17 versus wide receiver 27. Very close, very narrow. And then you look at the gap by ADP, it's wide receiver 11 versus wide receiver 55. So that really excites me for him. You also look at him benefiting the most from no more Michael Thomas. With Michael Thomas off the field, Rashid Shaheed, 20% target share, 2.16 yards per route run. These are like mid-range wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 2 numbers. And you can get them at an absolute discount. Also like elite zone beater. So like I always play him in zone heavy matchups in DFS. He's made me so much money, but you can draft him where he's going, keep him on the bench and just play those zone heavy matchups. Shout out to the Fantasy Points data suite. Check out our coverage shell tool. So big on Rashid Shaheed, amazing best ball pick. He's also like better in best ball archetype. There's so many of these players going in drafts right now where it's like, I like Chris Olave. I just like this other guy more. And like, I wish I could just kind of pinch them a little bit in my rankings, or I just prefer to target the other one. And that's the case with Shaheed right now.
It's a meme opportunity for you. The calling HR one, the call HR meme where you got to have the one guy's the good looking guy saying something about Olave, and then the nerdy guy saying something about Shaheed, and she calls HR. It's writing itself for you, Scott. We got a couple more teams to cover. We're already over an hour here, but we're firing away some winning information right here. Press coverage. If you're enjoying Scott, make sure you hit the like button. Let's talk about Carolina. You have it's a Dave Canales offense. It's Brad Idzik is technically the offensive coordinator, but Dave Canales is a guy who I think is very smart. You talked about how smart you think he is. It's a guy who maximized a lot on Tampa Bay last year, whether it's Baker Mayfield, whether it's Rachaad White, whether it's Mike Evans. A lot of things went very, very well, and they punched above expectations ADP-wise. Let's first talk about Jonathan Brooks. You're big on him. It's a guy that I had in my dead zone RB targets. Obviously, he's hurt now. It's creating a little bit more of an opportunity. So my question to you is, still in on Jonathan Brooks, despite him being a little bit of an injury setback here. Not as much. It's expected, but it's still a little bit disappointing. And does Chuba Hubbard have short-term utility in this offense?
Yeah, so I love that he had a setback. Like he's now even cheaper. Like this is fine. I would still be taking him multiple rounds ahead of where he's going. I am all in on Jonathan Brooks. Basically, Canales has said multiple times, like he's going to be in the Rachaad White role once he gets up to speed and is fully healthy. What is that? That's one of the most valuable roles in fantasy. Rachaad White ranked first in snaps, second in carries, fourth in receptions. Rachaad White might not be good. Like all the underlying metrics, especially on the ground, are horrible. Like dead last of any running back in rushing yards over expectation per carry, behind like Jamal Williams, Zeke Elliott, like super dusty guys. And Jonathan Brooks, a player I was super high on, very talented, like numbers in his last season, eerily similar to numbers in Bijan Robinson's last season, the same offense. So I am all in. With that, I would just say to remember that the final 4 weeks of your fantasy season matter exponentially more than the first 7 weeks. And so, yeah, you're not drafting him right now at a place where you're counting on him to start week 1 either. So I see him as a second half league winner. Love the player, love the fit. I'm all in.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it. It's even more of a value. It just you just have to adjust a little bit structurally, knowing that you're not going to have him potentially for the beginning of the season. But I found it quite easy to draft Jonathan Brooks and then follow up with Chuba Hubbard. There's been some positive buzz with Hubbard. Hubbard's a guy where we might only have to use him for 4 games. But Jonathan Brooks, I agree with you. I think the reason they used such an early pick on him was I think he's going to be the focal point of the entire offense, much like we saw Rachaad White go over 300 touches. Jonathan Brooks, with his receiving ability, can be a 3-down back. And then, the Hubbard is a guy where he's really a handcuff to begin with, but I think he can get you by in the first few weeks of the year. One guy whose ADP is rising is Deontay Johnson. You're enthusiastic about him as well, Scott, especially in this sort of Mike Evans X role with minimal competition in terms of targets with the other wide receivers there.
Yeah, when I put out my underdog values article, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 weeks now, I said he was the single best pick you could make at the wide receiver position. I know he's climbed in price, but I'm pretty sure that's still the case. I just absolutely love him. I've always loved the player, always loved the talent. Elite separator by ESPN's open score, by our ESPN's open score. He's been best in the league since he entered the league. By ours, he's, even last year, like top 3, top 5. And like, what has this offense desperately needed? It's guys who can separate, and he's elite at it. Like Adam Thielen, super dusty, but like, look at what he did in the first half before he fell off. Great volume, great production. And I think Deontay Johnson can do quite a bit more than that. Like, the buried lead here is like, this is one of the offenses I think has the potential to explode. This is my bet for this year's Houston Texans, an offense everyone's sleeping on, that could just go crazy. Like Bryce Young, I know you have some great Bryce Young stats, but he had a bottom 3 year since Vietnam, the war, Vietnam, by adjusted yards per attempt, by just yards per attempt. And I think we can just see this like miraculous turnaround. You look at Canales' track record. Geno Smith was best known for having his jaw broken by a teammate. He Freaky Friday'd with Russell Wilson, like leading the league in completion percentage over expectation. Baker Mayfield signed off the street, brings the team to the playoffs, top 12 in EPA per dropback. And so like, I wouldn't be surprised if Bryce Young, I'm not really drafting him as such aside of like for stacking reasons, but if he has like a 2022 Tua type year, don't forget people were calling for his head. He just signed this massive contract, but there were Dolphin fans who thought he should get benched or he wasn't the answer, or 2017 Jared Goff like turnaround and like the ripple effects that would have on the entire offense. But at a bare minimum, must draft Jonathan Brooks, must draft Deontay Johnson.
Yeah, it's interesting. Xavier Legette is a guy who they drafted in the first round, gives him another big athletic wide receiver. There's even been some positivity on Jonathan Mingo, obviously not a guy to go draft, but the Carolina beat reporters are saying the guy's playing pretty well. So I think what's interesting is Carolina went out and signed interior offensive linemen this past offseason as free agents, sort of to protect their like 5'11" quarterback. So this is an interesting one with Bryce Young. They certainly have put weapons around him, and we can all agree that the Dave Canales hire was very much a Bryce Young hire. The guy's been this quarterback whisperer when it comes to Geno Smith, Baker Mayfield. Russell Wilson had his best year with Dave Canales, so I think he's really smart. We will see if he can turn it around with Bryce Young. Let's talk about Rashad. We'll talk about Dave Canales' former team, Tampa Bay. We can skip the Rachaad White. You already talked about him a little bit. And Mike Evans is steamed up big time in ADP. Obviously was rewarded this past offseason with a contract extension after leading the NFL in touchdown catches. But what's interesting, this is Liam Cohen taking over as offensive coordinator. You talked about his time at University of Kentucky, which I think was very interesting in the article. But one thing that has been talked about is Chris Godwin's slot usage. We're talking about a guy who's like a 50% slot snap rate. Last year went down into the 20s. His fantasy production dropped considerably. Massive gap between him and Mike Evans in terms of production. But now we're starting to see Godwin in the slot and a very promising rookie in Jalen McMillan playing the outside role. This is a wide receiver core that we're pretty excited about. And Godwin is one where you seem to be enthusiastic about him as a bounce back candidate.
Yeah, this was another one where I'm writing the article. I get to Chris Godwin. I finish the blurb and he skyrockets up my ranking. So we knew heading into last year it was going to be a down year for Chris Godwin. Why? Because he lives off of design targets in the slot. Dave Canales never does that. No screens to slot wide receivers historically. 2021, Godwin had 30 catches, 30 design targets. Next season, 33. And then last year, just 10. That really crushed him. Always leads the league in yards on those such targets. And Cohen does feature that. He also said he wants to use Godwin in a similar way to how the Rams have deployed Cooper Kupp in the past. That's the exact same thing as we were talking about with Calvin Ridley, Jamar Chase. It's like maybe Godwin at this stage of his career is not like peak Cooper Kupp in talent. Doesn't matter. It's like that is the most valuable role in fantasy. That's just, I hear that skyrockets up my rankings. And so a function of that are these design targets I'm talking about. The other more obvious one is he's going to be in the slot more. That's what Cohen has said. We're going to have Godwin in the slot more. And that's where he belongs. You look at since 2021, games where he's run 65% of his routes from the slot or more, 17.5 fantasy points per game. All other games, 12.4. You want to look at slot versus out wide yards per route run is the exact same thing. He was misused last year outside more than he should have been. They're going to remedy that. He's going to be where he belongs. So I'm not really in on Mike Evans at his price tag. I'm way more excited about Chris Godwin, who's going much later, somewhere around like wide receiver 37 in best ball.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And Evans is a guy where the steam has been sort of hard to take. Obviously, the one factor would be Baker Mayfield showed a real like propensity to hyper target Evans. Does that continue despite Chris Godwin being in the slot? We don't really know. But now last year you were able to pay like wide receiver 3 prices for Mike Evans. Now you're having to pay high end wide receiver 2 prices. He's older. That it's a tough one. It's not an easy click this year like it was last year. Now the final offense we're going to talk about is one where this was sort of my favorite offensive coordinator hire all offseason long. Ryan Grubb comes over from Washington University. Obviously, Kalen DeBoer gets the Alabama job. I don't think he gets the Alabama job without Ryan Grubb. I've had some pushback from people on this one. There's a lot of Kellen DeBoer enthusiasts out there.
So some insider said he had the job if he wanted it, but he wanted to stay in Washington for his family.
Yeah, I mean, the guy, it's crazy. Probably and this is to get galaxy brain in terms of college football hires. We saw Kellen DeBoer's tight ends coach is now the offensive coordinator at Alabama, where Alabama, you would go ahead and have their choice of anybody. But Ryan Grubb's able to get the guy who works for him into arguably the best offensive coordinator position in college football. So like Ryan Grubb, anybody who doesn't know it, Washington last year makes national title game. They're up there in terms of points per game, passing efficiency, strong blocking numbers. And he did the same thing at Fresno State.
Mm-hmm.
This is a guy who's been extremely effective as an offensive coordinator. And I think this was a very inspired hire. Instead of us having to talk about a guy like Luke Getsy, who's been places and what he did in another NFL job sort of being recycled, they go outside the box and they get this really fun college football hire. And personnel-wise, I love what you had to say. Why don't you first talk about how you think that this affects the wide receivers in Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, just look at what happened. We had one wide receiver from this offense get drafted day one. top 10 overall, and then 2 others drafted day 2. And yeah, his track record's insane. Like you said, before he joined Washington, the team was 4-8, and then they had their best year ever. Before he joined Fresno State, they were 1-11, and then they had their best year ever. Penix wasn't on anyone's radar, and then easily leads the league in passing yards over the 2 years together. Rome Odunze, same thing, leads all receivers and receiving yards. Dylan Johnson, even same thing, career high 488 rushing yards, and then 1,200 is 1 year under Grubb. And so like the way I see this wide receiver breaking down, like it's you can't ever project it this 1v1, especially going from college to pros. But I really do see it as sort of DK Metcalf as the Rome Odunze, Tyler Lockett as the Jalen Polk, and JSN as the Jalen McMillan. That, like, I think when you hear that, you because Polk went higher, you might get more excited about Lockett, but no, that has me way more excited about JSN over Lockett. I liked McMillan more than Polk personally. He was also better. He was the clear wide receiver too, when all 3 were healthy by like a significant margin. And Polk was really just kind of like deep threat only. I think he had the highest or second highest percentage of his yards coming on deep targets and go routes. And so that's kind of how I see it breaking down. JSN, like on paper, it looked like he had a great role last year, kind of like Rashee Rice, where he's in the slot and he's getting peppered with screens, but it was just, people who watch the film is like, it's just doing the same thing over and over again. That just like wasn't working. It was stupid. He also like elite by yards per route run out wide, and like used in more creative ways. So I'm pretty excited on him. I'm pretty excited on Metcalf. The one issue is just like the bottom line is it is like a crowded receiver room. And also like, we're talking about Grubb and like, we're really excited about Grubb and Grubb's passing attack, but Mike McDonald has made it so crystal clear that he wants to pound the rock. He wants to be a run heavy offense. So like, it's not going to be a case like Tennessee where it's just like, oh, now they're insanely pass heavy. It's still going to be a very physical running the ball offense. But it is certainly one to get excited about because, the upgrade in play caller here, I think looks to be a massive one just based on Grubb's history and like so many stupid things this offense we're doing, like at a bare minimum, are going to be rectified this year.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you talked up the Kenneth Walker, and he's a guy who's sort of in a range where he's cheaper than he was last year to draft him. I've been a little bit enthusiastic about Zach Charbonnet just with the new coaching staff. Charbonnet potentially taking a year 2 leap forward, but you seemed enthusiastic about Walker in the article. Do you kind of remain enthusiastic about him?
Yeah, but I'll be honest, that might just be my bias than anything else. Like I just didn't like Charbonnet as a prospect and he didn't really impress me last year. And I just think Kenneth Walker is like so freaking good as like he like crushed in my model as like being elite on the ground. And then you look at what that offense did the year after he left, like it was so, like he should have won that. He could have won the Heisman that year. Like how impressive he was. And like, I still think he's that good. For fantasy, he's always been like, I'm not drafting him. I play him in DFS in games Seattle is likely to win because he had that. He's the back we use when leading. Charbonnet, more the pass catcher, the back we use when trailing or whatever. But yeah, I think there's a chance we see less of a committee. Again, that might just be my bias. But I'm open to it. So I'm kind of scouring beat reports to see if we hear anything to that effect. But excited about it. Also, like a ton of buzz on Noah Fant, by the way. So he's a solid best ball pick.
One interesting takeaway in your article was, let's say things are not going well and Seattle starts off slowly. You think that Sam Howell, based on what he did at the University of North Carolina, might be a guy that they want to take a look at in the Ryan Grubb offense. And that's, obviously this is a Geno Smith's job to lose, but I thought that was an interesting takeaway as well, Scott.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. That came from Brett Whitefield, who was like, one of my hot takes is like, I think Sam Howell starts in the second half if Geno Smith isn't just like below average, but like maybe isn't good or isn't great. And Howell does really well in that offense because like that he ran the Grubb style offense at North Carolina. He was really good in that offense. And like last year as a rookie, he had to adjust to a completely different offense with like a horrible offensive line. And so, just don't be surprised if we see him in the second half and he does pretty well in this offense.
So I told you I'd keep you an hour. It's an hour and 25 minutes. We covered so many offenses today. This was awesome. I think this is one where you might want to go back and re-listen. That's how much good stuff we had coming out of this episode. Scott, let everybody know once again where they can find your work and what you have coming out at Fantasy Points.
Yeah, fantasypoints.com. Be on the lookout for my guys / my fantasy draft plan. It's the same article, but it's like the biggest, most important one I write. It's just basically follow these tips, draft these players, circle these players on your draft sheet, dominate your league. Has a really good track record over the years. And be on the lookout for Fantasy Points data, dropping average separation score and all the different tools built around that. I really think that's going to be a revolutionary add to the way we look at football analytics.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that one. And stick with us here at Press Coverage when we're dropping episodes like this every single week, getting you ready to crush your leagues this season. We'll see you next week.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.